Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan. This is our first episode being recorded in the new year, episode 13. Dmitry, how are you?
It's a good day. It's a good day, Conrad. And the first episode of the year, of course, we congratulate everybody celebrating Christmas at the beginning of 2023 here on the old calendar. So, as you may know, the Orthodox Christians on the old calendar celebrate Christmas on the 7th of January. So we, of course, congratulate everybody with the great feast day. And, yeah, wish a happy new year to everybody who hasn't watched our last episode of the year. Episode 12, that was a pretty good development. We do discuss the great sort of some of the things that took place last year, so definitely give that video a watch, especially the last 30 minutes of it. I think you'll find some interesting sort of summaries of what took place in 2022. Now, moving on from here, Conrad, I suppose you could lead us into exactly what we'll be discussing today. There's a few things on the cards for us.
Oh yeah, it's we talk for a few minutes, a few minutes at least before these episodes to figure out what to cram in because there's just so much going on. But we're gonna be talking obviously about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, this Christmas truce stuff. You know, people had a lot of opinions about it on both sides, of course. Soledar, Bakhmut, big moves are happening with Wagner, the MOD, militias. Of course, we're also going to talk about some prophecies. You know, people always ask us to talk about St. PAISIos. We are going to be talking a bit about St. PAISIos today. Don't worry. The Pope Benedict, he passed away. We'll be mentioning that. Things going on in Israel, things going on in the U.S., House of Representatives, big news stuff, implications for Ukraine. And then at the end, we'll have some analysis on, global Benepolitics, conspiracies, and some other fantastic stuff. And with all of that, we're going to start with the war, the front, where we kind of usually start these days, things going on in Russia. Putin called for a Christmas truce at one point at the behest of Patriarch Kirill. Dmitry, would you want to start there with some of our analysis?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, after liturgy on the 5th of January, Patriarch Kirill, this was in the AM still in the morning, Patriarch Kirill in a sermon announced publicly, and it was instantly published almost before noon, that, look, he'd like the Ukrainians and Russians to have a Christmas truce starting at midday on the 6th of January onwards until midnight, the end of Christmas on the 7th. So essentially a 1.5-day truce armistice. Now, what does this remind us of? Maybe going back to like our middle school, high school sort of history classes where we recall hearing about a World War I armistice that took place during Christmas, I think in 1914, at least for the first couple of years of World War I. So there is this tradition among, say, Christian nations when they celebrate a great feast day such as Christmas, and yeah, these nations are at war for political, geopolitical reasons, such as Ukraine and Russia at the moment, and of course, when Christmas does arrive, everybody has to kind of put down their arms and stop fighting just for, a couple of days, maybe a week at most. And so in order to, give all the Christians participating in the armed forces time to actually properly celebrate this great Christian feast day. Now, Patriarch Kirill, of course, asked both Presidents Zelensky and Putin responded amicably in the next, almost seemingly right afterwards, as if, and I think partially maybe they spoke about it ahead of time, that Putin instantly released a press release where he says, look, Russia's willing actually to go ahead of the armistice and not fight on the 6th and 7th of January 2023. Like, we're willing to put down our arms just for a bit and not fire any artillery shells, tell Wagner to stop, pushing forward in Bakhmut. So all conflict would essentially just be put to a hold. Now, what was the Ukrainian answer? Now, of course, we're recording this on the 8th of January. The Ukrainian answer from Zelensky, from even the head military staff, all the military info groups of the Ukrainian army, they all announced that no, we will not be holding a truce, sort of an armistice. We will not be putting down our arms for Christmas. And some of them even said things, offensive things, such as, and this is publicly all on Twitter and Facebook. You can follow the Ukrainian, head channels and kind of see these replies to this proposal by the Orthodox Christian leader, Patriarch Kirill, that the Ukrainian side basically just said, look, we celebrated Christmas on the 25th of December, so yeah, we won't be celebrating on the 7th. So, offensive things such as that, which may even be offensive to certain Ukrainian servicemen. And yeah, so Zelensky, of course, officially did announce that no, Ukraine will not be holding an armistice over Christmas 23, and if you recall correctly, I believe on Easter in 2022, there was a short armistice over Easter that weekend. So again, it seems like 10 months after, or not 10 months, but about 8 months after Easter, things have already heated up to such point, maybe a point of no return, that even great Christian feast days are not being, included on the sort of timeout list.
Oh, it's unfortunate, and from a realist perspective, of course, we could easily say that Patriarch Kirill and, of course, Putin could have seen this coming. They may have had no intention of not necessarily keeping it had they agreed, but had knowledge that the Ukrainians would agree to this under no circumstances, and were just hoping to take kind of a Christian PR victory, which that's fine. But at the end of the day, along the front line, both sides immediately exchanged fire. It wasn't like the Russian people were like, all these people I agree with, some accounts I like, were like, oh, what are the Russians going to do? They're just going to not respond. They're just going to take losses. Like, no, they obviously defended themselves when the Ukrainians didn't, reciprocate the truce. But that isn't to say that, one, you don't do these sorts of things as the leader of a Christian nation. Some people were saying that this is going to, like, of course, reading what Strelkov was saying and some of these other more, figures that seem to always be dissatisfied with what's going on. Maybe there was a bit of dissatisfaction among some of the troops that had taken heavy losses, but I think among the Russian general public, I don't think that it was something particularly scandalous. And with all that being said, I think the Christmas truce of World War I is a great testament to, Christian civilization. Not to say that, if anything, it's more of a little light on a blot that was, a terrible war of World War I, but it does show that now, like, even in Ukraine, a country where everybody is still, all the Christians are still technically on the old calendar, but all these people, all this politicalization has happened, and so many people wanted to celebrate it on the 25th, and they're schismatic on celebrating with uniate Catholics all the time. And in general, it just shows you that there's less unity among these two Orthodox nations now than there was under Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, disparate nations in the beginning of the 20th century, which is, very unfortunate to say the least.
Yeah, and of course, this wasn't the only tragedy that took place in the last week and a half or so. On New Year's Day, actually, the Russian media confirmed that 63 members, newly mobilized, actually, military members of the Russian army, were killed in an apartment complex. So they were essentially mobilized, trained, and moved out to the front in a small town just west of Donetsk called Makeyevka. Now, this Makeyevka village, I guess it's like a town. You could almost call it, several tens of thousands of people. But Makeyevka has been around in the news for the last 8 years. This is where a lot of the fighting has been taking place between the Donbass so-called rebels and the Ukrainian military over the last 8 years, heavily, because it's essentially the town right before Donetsk. So it was kind of like the front hold base. But so these mobilized troops were moved into this apartment building, and they were just resting overnight, maybe even celebrating New Year's Day. So this was on the 31st of December 2022. And of course, a US-funded HIMARS strike took out the entire apartment, killing, as the Russian media confirmed, 63 people. Some claim about 89, but of course the Ukrainians, as well as certain media Western sources, claim hundreds of Russians killed in this one strike. This is one of the deadliest, most successful, from a Ukrainian perspective, strikes that have occurred by the Ukrainian military, an artillery sort of bombardment of this scale, where they can reach 63 people like in one go, if not hundreds, as they claim. So, and of course, for those who don't understand that, what a HIMARS is, it's a high mobility artillery rocket system. Now, it's probably the most developed artillery system in the modern world. Essentially, it's if you can imagine a pickup trailer with a rocket, with a series of rockets attached to the back, it can shoot away, I believe, six artillery rockets, and I'm speaking in very layman terms here. So the point is this pickup truck military vehicle can move around very quickly and reposition. So it's very hard to calculate where it is at a given time. It's not very large as well, so you can kind of even hide it. It's very hard to spot from satellites. And so these high mobility artillery rockets, they drive around, position themselves, and it doesn't take for them long to GPS track, find a location on the map on, say, the Russian side. This is a Ukrainian HIMARS system, and simply fire off the rockets. Now, how far do these rockets fly? The HIMARS, and these are, of course, probably the signature weapons of the Ukrainian army. The missiles can fly up to 300 kilometers, but realistically 200 kilometers. So if you can imagine, that's roughly 240 miles in American terms. That's quite far. So you will never see or even hear this artillery shell flying in. And these HIMARS, the Ukraine, at December 2022, has amassed almost 20 of them. In September 2022, the Ukrainian side had 16 HIMARS. So, and of course, it's easy to say, well, the Ukrainian-Russian war front is 800, 1,000 kilometers long. Surely these 20 machines can't, cause that big of a difference. And they don't, frankly. HIMARS, they have a few weaknesses. One of them is that they're very bad at hitting mobile targets. So once they shoot at certain locations, not at targets. So they shoot at buildings, defense positions. They can't shoot at, say, a moving target. If someone moves, you do have several minutes to actually move out of the way. It's quite hard it's impossible almost to hit a moving target. They're great at shooting bridges, barracks, apartment buildings, like in this case in Makeyevka. And of course, the other, of course, benefit to HIMARS is that, well, They're very mobile. They're hard to track down. The Russians, I believe, haven't destroyed a single HIMARS since the beginning of this conflict, which is why the number has amassed from, I believe, initially was 8, then 16, and end of 2022, they now have 20. And all the HIMARS are produced overseas, of course. None of them are Ukrainian-made, so to speak. So it's all imported weaponry. And yeah, we've seen the first, probably the deadliest strike, essentially, of 22 happen right on New Year's Eve.
No, it was a big thing. The Ukrainians were making a big deal out of it, which shows you that it was their biggest strike. Like they, of course, propaganda had claimed bigger strikes before this. This is the only one with evidence, and the fact they're making such a big deal out of it shows that the ones that were before that they would just casually say, "Oh yeah, we did this." That was propaganda. But I think another thing that's coming with these new weapon systems, it shows that as Wagner, as military advances in Soledar, I believe it was just as of the recording of this video. Ukraine had fallen back to the salt mine, I believe, in Soledar, which this is in the Bakhmut area and along the Donbass front line. These are big advancements for Russia, and I think because of all of this, we're now hearing about Poland and a collection of other countries hoping to transport Leopard 2s, which are, kind of the premier Western tank right now that they're willing to send over into Ukraine, which they're desperately asking for. And in some ways, some people say this doesn't matter, that the Russian tanks are far superior to Leopard 2s. We've seen some footage of rumoredly Turkish tanks in Ukraine that have been really not faring very well to Russian artillery. And it seems in general that as Ukraine is falling back more and more along the Donbass front line, especially, that the West is like, oh wow, we got to send them some of this stuff. But at the same time, Ukraine wants it more, that they need it more than the West is still willing to give, despite Poland and Germany really willing to take the next level, which is providing tanks, which up until this point they haven't done. And as all this goes on, unfortunately, we're also seeing dramatic increase in the persecution of the canonical church. That kind of seems to be how it goes, that the Ukrainian state almost lashes out in anger for their military losses at the church, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, we're kind of seeing this, especially some of the bishops and the priests on the front lines or in these areas which kind of fall right on the fighting zones are now being, of course, persecuted and even prosecuted, legally speaking, in criminal courts in Ukraine for things such as anti-Ukrainian propaganda, supporting treason, things of this nature, like various, even racism and discrimination, funny enough, even though some of these priests and clergymen are ethnically and, I guess even genetically Ukrainian, so to speak, if such a thing even exists. But, yeah, so culturally, Zelensky has made this statement that, look, the Ukrainian culture supersedes any sort of religious affiliation you may have, whether that be neo-pagan, Orthodox Jewish, Orthodox Christian. You have to serve Ukraine first. If you do not serve, then, you either you fall in line with the status quo or you're going to be ostracized and, of course, pushed out and made illegal. So that's, of course, what's happening on the spiritual end. It has gone on into 23. Of course, some of the Russian bishops have responded with very radical things, perhaps we'll mention at the end of the episode. And namely, Conrad did mention the fact that Wagner has been incredibly successful in Soledar and Bakhmut, and that's exactly what's happening here. So the main Russian military arm is actually assisting in the current front at Bakhmut and Soledar in the form of artillery fire and sort of artillery tracking and marking, but mostly the frontline combat is being conducted by, at least on the Russian side, by this Wagner mercenary infantry. And so we see this mercenary group, and for those who don't know, Wagner is essentially the Russian equivalent, perhaps at this point even a larger version of Blackwater that served in the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns of the United States. If you guys know what Blackwater is, then you'll understand the reference. But Wagner in Bakhmut has recently, has had certain things occur. Firstly, they've been successful the last week. I remember a couple episodes back, we did mention the fact that, look, Wagner has been complaining that they haven't been pushing far enough. There was videos released where Wagner and mercenaries were swearing at the Russian leadership. They were saying, look, you guys, the military, the Minister of Defense is not supporting us, and there was a lot of crying going on. But now, after the new year, look, it seems like Ukrainians are leaving Soledar. Soledar is a really small settlement just north of Bakhmut. Bakhmut is essentially the main hub of the fighting in the Ukrainian war right now. It's a city which has been completely depopulated. All the citizens have been evacuated either to the Russian side or to the Ukrainian side. 60% of the city is allegedly destroyed. The former governor of Bakhmut reports, and he's, speaking about this from Kiev. But yeah, I do believe it's kind of like a new Mariupol, you could almost say. Like, the Russian military is pounding it with artillery. The Ukrainian military is pounding it with artillery. Both sides are committed to kind of making a stand in this particular area. So I think there's a lot to be said. And of course, most interestingly, Wagner has employed, for the first time, we see direct evidence of its prisoner battalion, so to speak. There's a delegated group of former prisoners, former convicts from Russian prisons who are now being employed as soldiers by this mercenary group. Now, you may think, oh, well, hold on. How are prisoners and former criminals from Russian prisons being used in the front lines? This seems like unjust, immoral. But no, in fact, many countries over the centuries have, in fact, taken people from prisons and giving them these contracts saying, look, if you serve in the military, your sentence will be reduced. Now, morally and ethically speaking, former murderers, people for very violent crimes, assault, sexual assault, rape, things of this nature, even pedophiles, are not usually accepted into these groupings. But yeah, recently in Bakhmut, we've seen open evidence that, yeah, the Russians have been employing former prisoners, mostly non-violent prisoners, but yes, people from Russian prisons have been associated in the fighting, so that's quite interesting, I think. Conrad, I'm not sure if you have any comments on this. I don't believe Afghanistan or Iraq, because these were overseas conflicts, and the US kind of had its its kind of cream of the crop choice of who exactly to send overseas. The US never even had this, I guess, need to ever use prisoners in conflicts, I think, in the last, in the entire history, almost, you could say. Maybe even the Civil War.
Things were a little different at the frontier times because, people talk about frontier law and, what was a criminal and not a criminal sometimes out there before the law reached that area. But yeah, no, I mean, besides, the crimes actually committed, unfortunately, by American contractors and soldiers overseas, no actual, I think, prisoners were shipped over there to fight anybody. But we've seen that back in the day at the beginning of the conflict, there were some very interesting, I wouldn't say inspiring, but, perhaps just interesting videos of Sergei Prigozhin going to these prison yards and holding an AK-47 and giving these speeches to these men, and certain places like entire prison yards would sign up and join the Wagner group, which that's very interesting. This is very this is almost old world stuff, and I don't say that in a derogatory way, but unfortunately what's also very old world is the level of persecution, and there have been increased sanctions on some of the most beloved bishops in the Russian/Ukrainian church, as well as people being stripped of their citizenship. And maybe some of these men may not care so much about what it means to be stripped of Ukrainian citizenship, but that has real consequences. It means that the Ukrainian state no longer has to, guarantee you, quote unquote, the rights given to you by the Ukrainian constitution, which, the Ukrainian constitution, not that really has much power necessarily, but it still does provide you a certain level of legal reference to the state that is ostensibly persecuting you. And I was just going to read a quick list, actually, of all of the priests and bishops that have been stripped of their citizenship. Starting, we got Metropolitan Jonathan of Tulchin, Bishop Sergius of Ladizhinsk, Archbishop Varsinofi of Novoazovsk, Father Victor Anatolievich, Bishop Nestor of Yalta, Metropolitan Melity of Chernivtsi, Metropolitan Joseph of Romansk, Metropolitan of Dnipropetrovsk, Archbishop Ambrose of Volnovakh, Archbishop Arkady of Rovanki, Metropolitan Lazar of Simferopol and Crimea, Archbishop Paisios of Konstantinovsky, Metropolitan Arseny of Sviatogorsk, and I believe not just stripped of their citizenship, but actually sanctioned. We have Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye, and I believe Metropolitan Longin, who actually gave a homily where I was going to quote him as well. He says, "Today our Ukrainian state has begun a war against God, against the Church of God, and against the Ukrainian people. This is not fighting evil. This is not fighting the enemy, brothers and sisters. This is a struggle against the Lord God himself and his church. We ask that the Lord would bring to mind the insane people who think they're very strong and choose the war with God, heaven, and God's people. They begin to vote in regions, districts, in the Rada to stop the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It means to stop the Lord. Such crazy people have not yet seen the history of our church and the Orthodox faith." So this is all getting very serious. Metropolitan Luke has also spoken out. He, of course, is the Metropolitan of Zaporozhye, but he now resides in Melitopol, which is the second largest city in his archdiocese, which is currently under Russian control. So he is thankfully safe from actual, overt state persecution and possible, these people who say that kind of stuff, there are people in Ukraine that would just kill you. As we've seen, the priest was stabbed in the neck the past week by just a crazy alcoholic Ukrainian nationalist that stumbled into his church. So be sure to keep the church in your prayers, obviously. And again, for better or for worse, the priests, the bishops some of these bishops are not even, they've made no statements about being pro-Russian. They've made no statements at all. They've remained very moderate, but it just goes to show you that for better or for worse, for all these people, it would just be a lot better to be under the protection of the Russian military.
Yeah, of course. I think one of the primary problems that kind of goes under the radar, but you did mention that the bishops personally, of course, probably do not even care that their citizenship has been revoked. These people are monastics. Most of them are not married, or, especially all the bishops aren't married, but some of the priests possibly not married as well. So they have no real tie to physical property as such, personally speaking. But what this does encroach upon is the fact that, well, in their relevant dioceses, their dioceses are mentioned, under each particular form of, legislative. So they're given like business memberships. They're given tax exemptions, etc. There are these implications on a sort of property and real estate basis that these sanctions fall upon. It's like, okay, so the CEO, the chairman of your particular diocese is now an illegal citizen. What does this say about, say, who controls this particular church, parish, maybe this monastery or this historical building? Does the Ukrainian state now confiscate this particular property? And also, of course, implications of inheritance, probate law, things of this nature. Will say, if one of these bishops passes away in this citizenship exile state, who does he give his vestments to? Like, notice, people don't understand. They think, oh, well, priests, bishops, like, their vestments are cheap. No. Each one of these vestments has, like, they're worth thousands of dollars. Like, we're talking, and of course, this may not seem like a lot to some people, but usually the vestments of the bishops are somewhere north of $50,000 a vestment. Okay, this is just because the strings, the jewelry attached. Now, the bishop, once he passes, he needs to leave a certain deed to pass these things on to a diocese. If he is no longer part of that diocese or hasn't visited it, how could he pass on these material objects that he has, kind of worn as, members of his tonsure? This equipment has been given to him. How can he sort of, give it back to his diocese, even legally speaking? Like, this is a huge problem, and this great inconvenience now is probably stressing these great clergymen out. And Zelensky knows this. He probably has solicitors and lawyers and attorneys actually working on these issues to make the life of these Orthodox Christians miserable and horrible. Okay, so and of course, Lord forbid if any of these bishops have family, right? Because it's like, okay, well, the family members in hospital, it's similar to the COVID lockdowns, right? If we recall, when the lockdown will take place, could you visit your family members in hospital? Could you visit them? Could you perform, could a priest visit them and perform last rites? Could they could a priest give them a final confession in hospital, in a COVID ward, for example? Probably not, depending on your state, country, etc., the, level of COVID strictness, I suppose, that your particular state's enforced. But here in this case, can, say, Bishop Nestor of Yalta visit his family in Yalta, or visit even some of his spiritual children and give them last rites, maybe if they're, say, passing away or in old age? Probably not. So it's not like this will have this is really cruel what Zelensky has done. And these clergymen, of course, are incredibly brave for sticking to their guns and not actually, no pun intended, but they're actually sticking to this their positions. And mind you, some of these positions are not even that radical. Like, let's face the facts here. Like, Metropolitan Arseny of Svetogorsk, right? Probably the most beautiful monastery in Ukraine, besides the Kievo-Pechersk Lavra. So Svetogorsk Monastery is the biggest monastery in the Donbass region. So essentially it was controlled by the pro-Russian rebels, so to speak, since for the last 8 to 9 years. And it has been a hub for refugees, humanitarian aid. Both sides have been sending people there. And Metropolitan Arseny kind of oversaw this entire thing. And he never, not once has he spoken out explicitly in a pro-Russian statement. He's always been neutral and says, look, we need to pray, we need to help refugees. I'm not taking a particular stance in this conflict. Even when his monastery was openly bombarded, firstly by the Ukrainians, and I believe accidentally Russian shells fell on the monastery as well, and then the Ukrainians again. So this monastery is in the front line of fire, and Metropolitan Arseny still did not take an anti-Zelensky stance, and here he's on the censure list. So it seems like this Ukrainian government, it doesn't even care for the folks who have taken a point of neutrality or even a semi-pro-Ukrainian position. It's like, no, everybody gets sanctioned because we're going to put fear into the hearts of the Orthodox folks in Ukraine.
It's very true and unfortunate. And again, we asked everybody to pray for these people, but as the violence increases and as the Russian front line advances, you hope that the front line can move forward enough to where this beautiful monastery, the Pearl of Donbass, I believe I briefly mentioned it in my solo episode, can just not be razed to the ground. Multiple churches there have burned to the ground because of, there's even been sectarian violence, people on the ground that have infiltrated there to try to cause disruption and vandalism because they have some weird vendetta. Then they think that these people are pro-Russian sycophants. And I'm even hearing rumors that there's documents being brought up in the Ukrainian government to, with all these people that they censure and that take their citizenship away, that they're going to forge documents that prove that they were, collaborationists or whatever, or, Third Romists or Russian world supporters, which I guess if they could just, like we mentioned a few episodes back, I guess if they could just find a book that talks about Ukraine being Russia, which is, spoilers, most history books, if they can verify that as a reason to be an enemy of the state, I guess they won't be quote unquote trumped up charges. It'll just be bunch of silly nonsense. But is there anything else you want to let us know kind of about the war on the ground, about the persecution? Because we're going to shift more to the geopolitical and some of the stuff that Putin's been helping behind the scenes with Erdogan and Assad, as well as get into some prophecies about Turkey.
Yeah, I believe one of the micro issues that should be mentioned is just again, let's go back to the prisoner battalion operating in Bakhmut. There's some interesting stories coming out. I guess it'll be good to firstly report it, because I don't think other podcasts are actually doing this. But so, according to the Russian mainstream media, 6 prisoners from the Wagner mercenary group, now, by prisoners, we mean they were recruited from prisons by Yevgeny Prigozhin, and they were recruited into the Russian, mercenary group to fight in Ukraine. Now, these 6 former prisoners have escaped in Bakhmut, and Bakhmut is this, mind you, it's like where the peak fighting is happening. Both sides are shelling like almost 250 shells a day. Like the city is completely destroyed. It's a wasteland. It's like a Call of Duty map, which with all intents and purposes, like extremely intense, and the survival rate is very low. Let's just say. So 6 prisoners have heavy machine guns, grenade launchers. They've escaped. Okay, so these 6 people have gone completely rogue, and this happened literally right on New Year's Eve, I believe the 30th of December 2022, and it's quite interesting. So they're still unfound. It's still unconfirmed where these 6 folks have went, but so they're still running around. They're kind of like a Pirates of the Caribbean storyline going on there. And the first time we ever heard of a deserter, so to speak, was on the 7th of December. A Wagner deserter in Rostovskaya Oblast, which is just east of Donbass, so actually inside of Russia, or the former Russian Federation territory. So actually, a man with a heavy machine gun, we're talking like 200 rounds, big machine gun, not an AK-47 assault rifle, began shooting upon just on the side of out of the. So this reminds me a bit of the Rambo first movie, where Rambo was chased by park rangers and police officers. So we have this former mercenary guy just suddenly start shooting at a police car out of the bushes and the forest, and essentially he injured one of the police officers with a machine gun. Fortunately, nobody died. He was detained, surrounded. This is on the 7th of December. So you do have these interesting fringe stories of, say, well, if there's a huge war going on, there's going to be these fringe escapades and people just kind of going AWOL, and this is what we're seeing here. It's kind of like Apocalypse Now, the film, where the guy ends up joining the tribe, the American military colonel ends up leaving the American military and joining this tribe of Vietnamese, spiritual whatever, this group somewhere in the jungle. And here we have these former Wagner prisoners, former mercenaries, essentially just having enough of the conflict and actually just running off. And of course, what else is interesting is 3 other prisoners were announced dead, and how the announcements occur. It's not like the Wagner has a website where they say, okay, so we have X amount of mercenaries dead. Each particular city from which the prisoners were formerly, they would say citizens of, right? So each particular city, so this city in particular in Saratov, right? It announced on its official Saratov city website that, we have 3 prisoners, former prisoners, members of our city who have passed away in the Ukraine. They were killed in action. Now, what's interesting about this is one of the people who was killed in one of the prisoners was a man named Andrei Berezhin. Now, Andrei Berezhin was a former, a convicted murderer, essentially, but not like a cold-blooded murder. He was cold-blooded because he was a gangster assassin, actually. He assassinated at least 3 people, allegedly 6 in the 1990s. If you recall, Russia and Ukraine in the 1990s was exceptionally criminally run, especially the early 1990s before Putin came to power, so during the Yeltsin years. And this guy was like an actual hitman, like from the Hitman games, going around assassinating people. He was sentenced eventually in 2012, and the other criminal charge, of course, he was provided was that Saratov has a local television station which he shot a grenade launcher at in 1994. So, for all these things, he was sentenced to 25 years in jail, and having served, I believe, 10 years in 2022, he was approached by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who says, look, well, you're a former assassin, you should join Wagner mercenary group. And this is the first case we've ever seen of a former, so to speak, murderer being kind of taken into the Wagner mercenary group, into this prisoner brigade. Now, this is a very questionable, because a lot of, even Tsargrad, the famous Orthodox Christian channel, was questioning, oh man, these former murderers, former people with criminal, these heavy violent crimes on them, they shouldn't be actually taken into the mercenary groups because it's a bit immoral. And I do agree, and maybe there's a difference between, a psychopath killing somebody and being a former, assassin or a bounty hunter or something of this sort. But whatever the case, we're simply reporting on it. We're not really making any moral judgments, but it is a little bit in that gray area here, where we have Wagner mercenary group already evidenced openly that yes, they are actually recruiting former assassins and former gangsters into their group. For better or for worse, we'll see how this kind of plays out. So yeah, some interesting news about the prisoner brigades. Like, first time we actually have some solid information about them, and at this point, no information about numbers, how many have totally fallen, how many have been actually recruited into the Wagner mercenary organization. We don't have those numbers. They're not published on Russian websites, nor English ones. So it's pretty much all speculation and sort of fragmented, compartmentalized news pieces.
It's all very interesting stuff. I'm very grateful to the Wagner Group for no other reason than providing us with some of the best footage, some of the best information. They're kind of not restrained by governmental secrecy so much, but at the same time, because they're not directly part of the Russian military command, they're not able to give up grand strategy with their posts and everything like that. It's same with it's not really so much anymore coming out of the Donetsk and Luhansk militia, because those have all been completely integrated into the Russian military at this point. So it's just Wagner at this point that we're getting some of these early information, this earlier footage, because if you see footage from the Russian military, that's like months old. Like, they won't even post footage where the current front line, like where the front line is at a current state, because that would just, in their mind, be giving up way too much intelligence. And I'm not even saying they're wrong. And the Wagner Group have also built their huge facility in St. Petersburg, this like giant kind of futuristic glass, never-ending balcony interior. It looks almost like the Guggenheim Museum in New York, but even more like reflective. It's all very interesting. But unless you have a few more things to say about any of that, you talked about a gray area. Speaking of gray areas, Turkey, probably the grayest of all the gray countries in this conflict, making it one of the most interesting. Erdogan, of course, being very much against exactly like the NATO line, obviously not necessarily supporting Russia, but he's trying his best to maintain their relationship. He's trying to move forward with his gas hub idea that Russia supports. And even more than that, he's completely making up with Assad, Russia's probably number one or number two ally. And whether we'll be getting Assad Erdogan summit or an Assad Putin Erdogan summit or both at different times is likely, in fact. And with all of that, it also brings to light word about the U.S. interference in Turkey, because at this point the U.S. is not happy with Erdogan at all. John Bolton says, we want Turkey out of NATO. What are your thoughts on some of that, Dimitri?
Well, I think regardless of John Bolton's statements, Turkey being in NATO is one of the guarantees, of course, because one of the guarantees of NATO's success, because Turkey does cover NATO's, I suppose, southern reach, so to speak. And remember, originally when the whole Iran issue came around, where the US was infringing upon Iranian missiles, and they said to Russia, well, we're positioning our defensive missile systems in Turkey in order to protect Russia from Iran. This is a benefit to Russia. So Turkey as an outpost for NATO missiles is, of course, key. This is what forced the whole Cuban Missile Crisis in the first place in the 1960s, when and this was shown in all kinds of mass media, including movies such as X-Men First Class and things of this nature, when Khrushchev sent ships with nuclear missiles to Cuba in order to mimic the fact that the US has sent nuclear weapons to Turkey and kind of placed them all around Anatolia at the time. So Russia was technically during the Soviet years in the 60s trying to turn Cuba into the sort of its own Turkey, right under the belly of the United States, just as Turkey is technically right under Russia's, I suppose, soft side. And the missiles from Turkey, they can fly far enough to reach Moscow and St. Petersburg, essentially. But besides that, I guess just on a side note, Moscow is one of the only cities in the world which has a complete nuclear shield. Like, it's been up since the 1960s, and I think it's still functional, and it's always being refurbished. It's not spoken about a lot. I believe Israel has one, but Moscow does have some of the best anti-nuclear defense capabilities on the planet. So, for better or for worse, Moscow remains safe. But of course, Turkey being in this sort of gray area, yes, the US will need to keep it in NATO. It's, of course, regardless of Mr. Bolton's statements, I think it's certainly in the interest of both Republicans and Democrats to sort of, even if this means sacrificing the whole, sacrificing, I suppose, Assad's Syria, giving Assad, free reign. If Turkey needs to follow its personal interests as well as, remaining in NATO, I think that's the sacrifice the US military-industrial complex will need to make.
So interesting, because if there's anybody that I think would get kind of high on their own farts and be deluded about the state of military decline in the United States, it would be John Bolton. And I guess he sees the loss of the massive Turkish military as not a loss to NATO, but it is. I don't know why. I think it must just be a rhetorical tactic for a greater ploy to likely, I believe, oust Erdogan in the 2023 Turkish presidential election. We have arrived in that year, I guess. Got to get used to it. But I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that. We had Assad and Erdogan agree that the Kurds are a outpost of Israel and the US and are subversive actors, which seems to be true considering that Kurds were the primary instigators of the Iranian protests. Iran just executed one of the instigators who's on video killing a police officer, but the US doesn't care about that. We're going to mourn him and use it as a pretext for more intervention in that country. But with all these things, Erdogan is very much showing that he is not exactly controlled by US interests. And there are large factions in Turkey that are beholden to US interests, and a large opposition that I think is very much queued up by globalist powers to take over from Erdogan, which very much lines up with a lot of what St. Paisios, and which is echoed by Metropolitan Neophytos, a lot of what he says. So I'm actually going to read a little bit of that now. St. Paisios talks about how we of course know that there's all this prophecies about the Bosphorus Straits and the war with Russia and Turkey. And what Metropolitan Neophytos said, as he heard from St. Paisios, was that Erdogan will fall, and after him, inexperienced people, pro-Westerners, Kemalists, which is a Turkish political ideology, will take power and they will create big problems. He says, and their friends, the pseudo-friends, the Russians, will transform into enemies in one night, and there will not be a single city in Turkey which will not be bombarded. This was said after the Kemalist comment. And then St. Paisios, this is actually from him, he says, after the Turkish provocation, the Russians will descend to the Bosphorus Straits, not to help us being the Greeks. They will have other interests. But without wanting it, they will be helping us. Which totally makes sense based on the current geopolitical relationship between Russia and Greece. And then he goes on to say, when this generation of politicians that govern Turkey will cease, the new ones will undertake. He says that's when all that will happen. And that new generation, I think, is going to be the ultimate NATOist, pro-Western group in Turkey, secularists, as they would be less even Islamic than Erdogan, who, of course, spearheaded the transformation of Hagia Sophia into a mosque, and even other actually historic monasteries.
Yeah, that's right. I think all the prophecies, they do point towards the fact that, yes, despite the fact that Turkey and Russia are allies in many ways today, and of course not the strongest allies, like the US still has closer ties to Turkey than Russia does, but Russia's proximity to Turkey and also Russia's an understanding between Russia and Turkey in regards to Islam and Orthodox Christianity does sort of cement this idea that, well, how can a war take place in the future? But the prophecies do state clearly that, yes, eventually this ancient conflict, that Turkey is Russia's, I would say, the foremost enemy Russia had historically. Like, Russia has fought the Turks and the, I suppose, agents of the Islamic Caliphate for the last 600 years. Like, on and off, so to speak, but there were at least 6 or 7 Russo-Turkish wars, and you could say, like, some of the Mongol Khanates, especially when they converted to Islam, like the Crimean Khanate, have become vassal states of Turkey. So Turkey does have this history with Russia that's not so amicable, and even today, Putin and Erdogan, who are both, mind you, very similar. We've spoken on previous episodes about this. Like, Erdogan and Putin both have enormous balls in terms of, so to speak. Like, they are very brave. I remember when the coup occurred in Turkey in 2016, and Erdogan, there was an actual military coup in 2016 that took place in Turkey, and what did Erdogan do? He didn't run away into a bunker. He was at his holiday place when it was ongoing, and he made calls. He traveled to the capital. He made active political decisions during a coup in which he could have easily been killed, but no, he did not run when things happened. Unlike, some other recent characters in politics, I won't name names, but Erdogan does have this sort of Trump/Putin sort of power to him. He does have this gravitas, and if anyone does go to war against Turkey, I don't believe it'll probably be between Putin and Erdogan, as you said, Conrad. Like, there is this understanding that the US needs to replace Erdogan with somebody a bit more liberal, a bit more malleable, someone who doesn't view Turkey as a sort of following its own interests. I think that maybe that's when the prophecies of Saint Paisios will come into fruition in the future, is when Erdogan, say, is replaced, and he's this really, like, I guess a very Islamo nationalistic persona, is replaced with someone a bit more liberal, a bit more toxic even to orthodoxy in a way, and that particular government will go against Greece, and then Russia will intervene, and that's when we'll see those actions take place. That's just my supposition. Of course, anything can happen, but we do need to keep in mind these prophecies are still on the cards, and the words said by Saint Paisios have not taken place yet, so it's still yeah, absolutely a possibility, and, you know, we should pray to God that, you know, we aren't caught, I suppose, in line of those great calamities in the future.
We definitely, anybody caught in this, we hope that they're never caught unrepentant, as is the goal of these prophecies, as has been so iterated by Metropolitan Neophytos, who's kind of the biggest witness, the direct anthropological, you know, incarnate witness of some of these words from these great saints and prophets. But one of the big reasons that the U.S., of course, would also benefit from getting rid of Erdogan, the U.S. doesn't like that he turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque. They don't like these big, hard lines being drawn between, like, Orthodox Christianity, and these other people that they ostensibly consider their allies, especially NATO. And so they would much rather have a more secular government that wouldn't do that. And they would hope that they could even reproach with Greece, because as of now, Greece is just a total debt slave to the European Union, and are even been sending not a lot, but, you know, doing minimal support and stuff to Ukraine, because their government have proven themselves as total globalist, World Economic Forum nonsense stooges. The Mitsotakis government, I don't know any Greek person that's really enthusiastic about them per se. And despite all of this, we've seen the words of the most likely successors of Erdogan. There's a video, I'll have it linked below, just like I'll have this other video I'm going to mention, from the fantastic Christian Orthodox Miracles and Prophecies YouTube channel hosted by Panagiotis. I encourage everyone to subscribe. I'll have that linked in the Substack and the YouTube notes. But he has talked about some recent developments in Greece politically, that were actually spoken about by St. Paisios. He had mentioned the amount of nautical miles that the Greek exclusive economic zone and Greek territorial waters from some of their islands, and them moving it forward. Greece has been actually attempting to militarize some of their islands, which goes directly against Turkish interest. And as I said, these people that are going to succeed Erdogan, they've expressed they're just as willing to go to war with Greece and invade these islands as actually Erdogan is, just out of sheer Turkish national interest. And Greece and Turkey both are it's very popular on both sides to spew vitriol and do bellicose rhetoric against the other side over these islands. Of course, Greece views all of Anatolia as theirs. The Turks at the very least want more islands, because there's islands just a few miles off the coast of mainland Turkey, completely controlled by Greece. And so in this video, Panagiotis translates from some Greek news sources and everything. And St. Paisios talked about the border being moved eventually to 12 nautical miles, and then eventually 6 nautical miles, I believe, off the coast of Turkey, or in some regard from some of the islands, and from Crete as well, regarding some resources that they would even want to exploit. There's also in Cyprus disputes over Greek, Cypriot, Turkish utilization of new natural gas and oil reserve that have been found in the Eastern Mediterranean. But one of the things that the Turkish government responded after Greece has been militarizing these islands and moving their exclusive economic zones, they made 4, not demands, but they stated 4 things that need to not happen that could provoke a reaction from Turkey. One of them saying they generally dispute the Greek islands' sovereignty of all. They want all the islands to be demilitarized. They say no to any extension of the exclusive economic zone and the nautical mile barrier off of the Greek islands. And they also demand that no prime minister, any kind of government minister, visit the Greek islands. They gave the example of Samos being one of the closest ones to Turkey, as that would be deemed a provocation. And so, with all this going on, I mean, as Erdogan is still here, he's of course very willing to increase rhetoric with Greece, but likely would not attack a fellow NATO member that would very much push him one side of the issue against, you know, his current ostensible allies in the West. But there's obviously talk about kicking them out of NATO. That's really unlikely, considering Turkey is a founding member, the second largest military. Again, as Dimitri said, I would agree with him. I think it's more likely that we see a very large attempt to, you know, reinforce the election, as they did with Trump, you know, to get the right people in, as the U.S. likes to say, in 2023. But we're going to be watching it very closely, of course.
And speaking of reinforcing elections, of course, more on the home front, and we do see, of course, the election of Kevin McCarthy into the Speaker's seat of the Senate, of the American Congress. So this, of course, has been developing all throughout the early week of 2023, and I've not seen the stalemate of this scale, I think, since for a while, probably since, and politically, we haven't seen the stalemate of this scale since the dispute between the Biden and the Trump presidency, when that was delayed for about a month and a half or so. And of course, do you have any comments on that, Conrad? Because in my eyes, it was essentially not just a debate between, say, oh, well, what's happening between, the Trump side or the never Trumpers and those who are pro-Trump in the American Republican Party, but also some of the more right-leaning congressmen such as Paul Gosar and Matt Gaetz. Of course, their contribution, or at least their opinions on some of the even foreign policy, perhaps spending or pro-Ukrainian leaning attitudes in Congress, have sort of become kind of mainstream. Like, they are the main oppositionists towards sending billions of American taxpayer dollars to Ukraine. So in a way, it does have implication on the whole geopolitical great scheme issues we were speaking about here. And now, so to speak, Trump himself and those people standing with Trump are not exactly pro-Ukraine, or they're not anti-Ukraine. They seem to have more of a neutral position. Trump hasn't really said too many positive things about Zelensky, but he hasn't really gone against him either. I think it's more of a political utilitarian stance here. And yeah, so we see the election of Kevin McCarthy, who is arguably very pro-Ukrainian. And yeah, I'd like to hear sort of your opinion about his election, because that's only taken place this weekend, on the Christmas Orthodox weekend of the 7th and 8th of January. So it's kind of a new development. I really want to see where all of this goes, what implications this will have on American domestic as well as foreign policy.
Well, we did get the situation that is probably most likely to, maybe in some sense, possibly legislatively, through the actual process of government, reduce the amount of aid going to Ukraine, which, again, that's not to say it's guaranteed. McCarthy, he wore the Ukraine pin and the Ukraine pocket square at the same time. So he made sure to really signal his support in a really stupid aesthetic way. I don't know why, it just looked weird, but he's very pro-Ukraine. The only anti-Ukraine voices, you can't even call them anti-Ukraine voices, they're just America First voices. Obviously, Matt Gaetz, Paul Gosar, Lauren Boebert. So these are the only people that have actually spoken out against aid to Ukraine. And at the end of it all, only 6 representatives actually held out completely against McCarthy. And that's not to say that I think that Chip Roy, Gosar, that ended up voting for McCarthy, I don't think it was necessarily a betrayal. I think it was, the message was still sent that we're skeptical of you, but you did give us enough concessions that we're not going to risk some kind of Democrat speakership or even a Scalise speakership, because Steve Scalise, who in theory could have taken over besides Kevin McCarthy, it would actually even be slightly more to the center than to the right of Kevin McCarthy. But those representatives were Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert, Bob Good, Andy Biggs, Matt Rosendale of Montana, and I'm forgetting the 6th one, sorry about that, but they really held out. Those are some great representatives right there. Lauren Boebert barely won. She won by like a few hundred votes in her district in Colorado, so it shows you that the disaster of the midterm really actually helped Kevin McCarthy, because if a few more of those ones had flipped to the Democrat, McCarthy wouldn't have even had that much strong of an opposition. But one of the leaders of the negotiations that ultimately got what I believe is going to be 2, maybe even 3 Republican Freedom Caucus, like the Patriots, like, Chip Roy, Matt Gaetz, these guys, they're members on the Rules Committee for the upcoming Congress, which would be huge, as well as a few other pretty powerful demands. Of course, a larger number of Freedom Caucus members on all the important committees, maybe even some chairmanships for some more patriotic, right-wing congressmen, the leader of that being Chip Roy, my representative here in the state of Austin, Texas. So proud of that. I've met him a few times. It was so I'm proud to have a representative. It's not easy. There's like maybe 6 representatives you can kind of be proud to have right now in American government, and I'm proud to have one of them. So that's very good. But like I said, there's not necessarily any guarantees that we're going to get a reduction in aid to Ukraine, but perhaps if the Patriot wing can really push its muscle with nonsense that Biden and the Senate try to push through, and Ukraine continues to take these obvious losses, and public opinion continues to shift, which it has. I believe even National Review is publishing stuff about extreme Ukraine fatigue. The majority of people do not care about this. It's total waste. So if National Review is publishing that, it kind of shows you where the current state of public opinion is in the West on the issue.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose more interestingly, I guess, in U.S. foreign policy developments, Biden's planned visit, of course, to to Mexico has recently been precluded by a very tumultuous, shall we say, arrest of El Chapo, the famous Mexican cartel crime lord's, I believe, 29-year-old 29-year-old son. So the son of this Mexican crime lord was, of course, apprehended by Mexican federal police and taken into custody. And now what this caused was huge cartel war in the northern town of Sinaloa. Now Sinaloa is famous for its, I guess the entire region is famous for some of its drug trade as well as drug production, which the cartels do control. Now you may think, like, how does this impact any sort of foreign policy? Or, well, if you've been following the whole Mexican ordeal, like, Mexico is probably the most tumultuous neighbor of the United States, of which it only has two, essentially Mexico and Canada. And so Canada is very controlled by, shall we say, globalist New World Order powers. I mean, if we go in conspiracy mode here, but Mexico is kind of like the gray area. Like, Mexico is very Catholic, generally speaking. It is conservative. So how do you keep a country such as Mexico with hundreds of millions of people in check? Well, you promote crime, you promote sort of cartels to cause, menace and a ruckus on the border. You kind of keep the country unstable. Like, this would be a great foreign political boon, I suppose, to the American deep state and the globalists controlling the United States. And why I mention globalists and why I'm coming at this from I guess a more Alex Jonesian angle is because one of the stories Alex Jones reported on in 2012 and 11 was, of course, the Obamagate Fast and Furious scandal, where Barack Obama's government was caught handing out untraceable weapons to the Mexican cartels. Now, handing military-grade weapons to the cartels was, of course, this was never prosecuted or chased up on by anybody, but this occurred almost 10 years ago, and Alex Jones was one of the first, I suppose, independent reporters who actually broke the story, which is, I think, a great, kudos to him. It's a great achievement, one of his, probably, I'd say, top 10 things, like a feather in his cap for that. But more recently, so Mexico is kind of breaking out in the region of Sinaloa specifically. I'm not going to say the whole of Mexico is going into a civil war, but at the moment, at least 29 people have been reported killed. Members of the cartels, these are the criminal gangs, actually, who's one of the chief members was, of course, captured by the federal police, as well as members of the Mexican federal police, even members of the Mexican military, actually. So it's gone to the point where some of these criminal organizations in Mexico are so armed that the local police cannot even handle the heat at this point. Like, they have Kevlars, they have 50 cal sniper rifles, they have heavy machine guns, they even have, I'm not going to say like artillery and cannon, but it gets quite rough. It's like everything before, say, heavy machinery such as tanks, the Mexican cartels already have. So rocket launchers, RPGs, yeah, it's pretty insane. Now, the sort of the exercise I had, at least when I was reading about this, I was saying, well, this is quite rough. Like, Mexico was always known as a place where the Mexican government has always tried to deal with crime and corruption and all of this. But what is the analogous situation in Europe? Well, Ukraine technically is similar to being in Mexico of Eastern Europe. Like, it is a large country with a huge population, as does Mexico. It has a large degree of corruption, unfortunately. It always has for the last 30 years. And now Ukraine has an influx of weapons and machinery and things such as Stinger missiles and military-X drones with explosives attached to them that has not been seen yet. Like, the Ukrainian battalions, so some of the neo-Nazi battalions such as Aidar, Azov, etc., even the right sector battalions, which are more like political organizations, are now more armed than the Mexican cartels are. So now we're looking at Mexico and all these cartels sort of fighting back against the Mexican government. Now imagine what would happen if some of these neo-Nazi battalions began standing up against Zelensky, or say Ukraine defeats Russia. What would happen on the Ukrainian mainland, like in the country itself? Like, will everybody fall in line and just begin voting for the next president, or will the country sort of break apart and military gangs take over these particular areas? Probably the latter. And not just that, but you can just imagine the amount of like black market military weapon trading that will take place in Ukraine. So Ukraine, and where all these weapons even come from? Let's just remember the Obama Fast and Furious scandal. Like, these weapons are coming from overseas makers. They're not made in Ukraine. They're being imported into the country. And so again, just as Obama was sending weapons to the Mexican cartels in order to keep the government occupied, so is the US government sending weapons to Ukraine now in order to keep the Russians occupied. And it's very, of course, you can say, well, geographically, these are all very different scenarios, but I'm going to tell you this: if Ukraine does come out on top in this conflict, there will not be any peace. No, peace is long gone. Okay, the only way peace can be established is if there's a proper Nuremberg-style justice system, enforced on this area, and when everybody, marked as neo-Nazi can be, properly tried, etc. But at this point, Ukraine winning does not mean peace. Ukraine winning will mean similar situations to what's happening in Sinaloa, Mexico at the moment, where you have these huge cartels armed to the teeth with military-grade weapons fighting back against the police. Ukraine will have the same issue. These neo-Nazi battalions are not going to listen to Zelensky or any other, bureaucrat in Kiev.
When you talk about Fast and Furious, it reminds me of earlier this year we saw all these huge trucks of Ukrainian mines and Ukrainian ammunition just happen to be in the back of trucks in Kosovo, of all places, of course. And, we have no idea how many of these weapons are actually ending up in the hands of Ukrainians. Not that that's a good thing regardless, but we have no idea how many of these are going to the Middle East, the Caucasus, Kosovo, North Africa, Libya. I'm sure thousands of these are in Libya already shooting at Haftar's troops and Egyptian proxies and they're arming. Well, John Bolton's arming Turkey inadvertently. If you think about the amount of different factions that are going on in some of these hot conflict destabilized zones that the U.S. has wrecked with its foreign policy frivolities. But Mexico, speaking of Mexico, of course, Trump, as we mentioned before, his biggest problem will be fading into irrelevance. He's doing his best here. This is a good statement, of course. This is from Fox News. Trump vows to deploy U.S. Special Forces military assets to inflict maximum damage on cartels. I believe this is from Jack Posobiec. He was going to order the military to declare cartels enemy combatants and deploy Navy and Special Forces to defend the land and maritime security of the Western Hemisphere. Now, that would have been a great thing to do while you were president, Mr. Trump, but if you do somehow pull it off in 2024, that would be great, not only because it would help secure the border in my here great state of Texas, but it would definitely be a good reason to get our troops away from everywhere else they are. I have family in the military. At this time, with the current state of relationships between Russia and Ukraine, I don't want my family members in Germany or in Poland or any of these places. I would much rather them be, defending the home front perhaps than about to get caught up in a battle with an actual, militarized army over what's effectively an anti-Christian crusade around the world. That all being said, Trump 2024 is looking more unlikely perhaps than it was even a few months ago, but this is a good move by him. It's a good way to garner support from the base, and this whole flare-up in Sinaloa obviously was a good excuse to bring that up and to exploit this current issue that's actually happening on our home front. Bring the Monroe Doctrine discussion back into things.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's the only way American foreign policy can remain kind of healthy, coming back to this idea that the US is like this global police officer. Now, that's only on the face of it, of course. In basic international relations, the US, and even if we follow a realist perspective, the US does not owe anybody anything besides, of course, looking after its own interests, which is operations like Fast and Furious, which we believe that they probably are pursuing personal interests. For example, keeping Mexico unstable by keeping the cartels well-funded and well-equipped to handle, local sort of affairs. And we see this even in mainstream media. This isn't even Hollywood folks are aware of this, movies like Sicario and TV shows like Narcos. These things portray certain elements of reality that's actually happening. So you have the CIA actually infiltrating and acting in these cartels, working together with them, as well as the Mexican government, playing both sides against each other. And this kind of reminds me of some of the folks, some of the viewers in the comments, of course, of the previous podcast. I didn't mention the fact that, I described Zelensky's speech as a slightly Hitleresque. Now, what I was saying was that his militaristic style of actually giving the speech, it reminded me of maybe some of the speeches Hitler gave back in World War II, or perhaps Goebbels as well, like his total war speech. And now you have to understand, Zelensky and the Azov Battalion, they are of course they have two different political, of course, opinions about Ukraine and how Ukraine should operate and run. And of course they only agree because the US and so other globalist interests, of course, make them agree upon certain things and ally. So what you need to understand is that foreign political actors do fund both sides of certain conflicts, and even sometimes they make them cooperate. For example, such as the corruption in Mexico. The U.S. funds the Mexican government and they fund the cartels at the same time. In Ukraine, Zelensky is funded and the Azov battalions are funded as well. So regardless of if the battalion of Azov and Zelensky don't actually agree upon, say, politics, and Azov battalion believes in a more autocratic sort of let's just say aristocratic model with a more Aryan sort of pagan undertones, whereas Zelensky is a very liberal democratic person with like very progressive values, even a bit too progressive for some of the far right people. So you need to understand that Zelensky giving this speech, it's because firstly because he's an actor and he can actually portray a Hitler, a Goebbels, a even Trump character. He's very good. His comedy specials, if you watch them back from 2012-13, are actually hilarious. He's a very good comedian. Zelensky is an A-tier comedian. He's better than some of the famous Western comedians, or even those outspoken ones such as Joe Rogan. Zelensky is probably Dave Chappelle level. Like, his comedy is A-tier in Russian and Ukrainian. If you don't believe me, you can go ask any Russian speaker out there or Ukrainian speaker. Like, they will agree with you. So regardless of how cringe Zelensky is, he's a very gifted actor, and him acting as a sort of militaristic persona, we're talking about the 45-minute speech that happened at the end of December. Him giving off that energy and vibe was to appeal to some of the more militarized sections of the Ukrainian state at the moment, such as the Azov, Aidar, Right Sector battalions. Some of these more radical Kraken, Tornado, these groups which are very far right wing, and so he can actually appeal to them without even being on their side. It's like this guy knows how to appeal to a varied audience, similar to how Trump, had these. Appeared on different, at different LGBT forums, at the same time appeared at evangelical Christian forums. Like, politicians have that ability to appeal to various groups at the same time, and Zelensky's doing exactly that. That's the reference which I made concerning, his very militarized German-like speaking. It's because notice his speech to Congress is more like we love progress, we love progressive values. Ukraine is independent. We want to be like the West. We want to be a globalized World Economic Forum type nation. That was the energy there. Meanwhile, the speech Zelensky gives to his own parliament is very different. It's like, Ukraine will stand to the last man. We don't need electricity. We're powerful. We're this huge ancient military force. Like, the vibe is completely different. Zelensky appeals to various audiences depending on the situation. He is a pragmatic actor in both a political as well as a professional sense. So please don't take it close to heart if you think I'm sort of saying Zelensky's right-wing. He is not a right-wing person, Zelensky. He is simply playing a right-wing character when it suits him and when it suits his handlers most.
Oh yeah, exactly. And again, as you had mentioned before we were not talking, and in the previous episode, there's no publication and amplification of that speech with subtitles. Like, it's got like a few hundred views on YouTube. Nobody cares. Of course, in that speech, he like openly banned the canonical church. He very much calls like members of the church terrorists and collaborators. All sorts of terrible stuff. You can look it up, of course, but it's getting no coverage. They don't want to talk about every other speech that he gave was plastered all over the news. But now that he's, now that it's crunch time and he needs to get the loyalists in line, no one in the West wants to show our audience exactly what's really going on over there, which is, it just goes to show you stuff, as they say. But when it comes to Mexico as well, AMLO, remember, I don't know if we have any Mexican listeners or not. I'm not an expert on Mexican politics, but for better or for worse, AMLO is sort of in the mold of these South American left-wing socialist nationalist guys, kind of like a Maduro, maybe like a Pedro Castillo, who was recently couped out in Peru. I believe he's hiding in Mexico. He's friends with AMLO. And AMLO is, while he's very much against the cartel, he wasn't as rhetorically, militaristic against the cartel as others, causing a lot of backlash in the U.S. that was used against him. And I think the U.S. would have somewhat of a vested interest in having someone that's more in line with neoliberal, Americanist interest in power there. And in many ways, Mexico has kind of been seen as a potential kind of distraction from America's enemies. You've heard about the Zimmerman telegraph with Germany and Mexico, and who knows how exactly real all of that was. But it's always been a worry that maybe some of our more powerful enemies would exploit our underbelly there. But of course, it'd be harder for them to do that if Mexican military is more like a kind of SWAT team that has to deal with these disparate cartel members, as opposed to, what it was during the Mexican-American Wars and the Texas War for Independence, when it was, an actual, almost European-style, massive Spanish Catholic military that, thankfully lost to my patriotic Texas ancestors. But in the end, Mexico is like Dmitry said, it's a huge country, way more populated than Canada, way more actually economically relevant as far as its industrial capacity, at least recently. But again, it's kind of at the chokehold of, there's even, of course, satanic interest. A lot of these cartels are openly occult, and it is not good for the people of Mexico, who in the past have actually fought some very valiant battles against the forces of communism and secularism in the name of Christ, actually. So There is a beautiful heritage in Mexico. Mexico could be a great place to live. In some ways, Mexico was a great place to live. I know certain provinces, like Mexico had a great, very much diverse in how it handled COVID. There were some states where you could literally do whatever you wanted. It was one of the best places to be. And then there's one or two other states where like they were trying to track every move you made. Our good friend Hervoye, who I've been on his show on TNT Radio, he's the host of Geopolitics and Empire. He has made it to Mexico, and I think he had a better time than a few other people. Not that it's perfect, of course, but compared to some places in the States and Europe, I think where he was in Mexico is a better place to be.
Interestingly, that you bring up the topic of COVID, just kind of to finish off this episode, I think one of the subjects we wanted to speak about was the fact that there was this, I guess, two particular opinions taking place, at least in the Orthodox world, for the last 2 years, where there's this hard anti-vax stance, and then there's this, well, the anti-vax position, of course, being, for all its validity, was also amplified by the fact that clergymen placed emphasis on it, and then, of course, there's the realistic, realist opinion where they said, well, look, certain vaccines and COVID enforcement, such as wearing masks in church, are needed for for the safety of the parishioners. Now, why I'm mentioning this is because, unlike in Mexico, where the Orthodox Church is a very small presence in countries such as Russia or even the United States, some of the clergymen took very one-sided positions on this. For example, in Russia, some of the most famous bishops made very outwards anti-vax stances. For example, Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev mentioned that, look, if you don't take the vaccine and somebody gets sick from you and that person passes away, then that's on your conscience and you have to go confess it. So, like, something like that is a very very kind of, and Metropolitan Alfeyev, the clergyman who said this, was very, like, he is technically a very influential clergyman, probably number 3 in all of Russia, or at least he was in 2020. But at this point, he is kind of viewed as sort of the more left-wing member of, like, the Russian ecclesia, the great Russian diocese, and the Russian church in general. So he does have very sort of certain progressive opinions. So that should be.
Well, he's sort of been he's kind of in exile to this point to Hungary. He's now he used to be the head of external affairs for the Moscow Patriarchate. I actually saw him preach at the Antiochian Cathedral in New York City a few years ago, but now he's in charge of the Russian mission in the Moscow Patriarchate in Hungary, which is a much smaller role. He's kind of been, I think, usurped by Metropolitan Tikhon of Pskov. And of course, Patriarch Kirill, while I believe he was vaccinated, he very much said that it obviously should be anybody's choice and all sorts of things like that. And they've obviously were all against any kind of mandate. And there were some also actually anti-vaccine bishops throughout Russia and other parts of the Russian world. I believe the only real place where you were in danger of falling for real vaccine tyranny was in parts of Moscow and St. Petersburg at the height of kind of the COVID mania. That's at least what I've heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And even members of the Russian Orthodox Church who are in politics, we're talking about laymen. For example, the mayor of Moscow was very pro-vaccine, but he quickly dropped it, and very pro-QR codes as well. So you had to QR scan, in the metro, at different shops. And even mask mandates were dropped in Moscow very quickly. So even the most progressive pro-vax, pro-COVID mandate folks in Russia really failed in their mission in order to enforce any sort of tyrannical, instances of, COVID tyranny, as Conrad correctly coined it, as we saw it maybe in some of the Commonwealth states or even worse first world nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, even some even like states such as New York and California. So we have like these sort of different sort of takes throughout the world, but generally speaking, the Orthodox world has been on point on the COVID issue. It has been very, very strong, and it actually had very like quite a bit of. There was a lot more redeemable things that came from this, rather than, say, what we saw maybe in the Catholic Church, where a lot of Catholic clergymen actually fell to this idea that, well, you actually cannot take communion unless you're jabbed, or things of this nature. Like, these opinions are extremely radical, and they never took place in the Orthodox Church, which I think is extremely admirable.
The only place we saw any of that kind of nonsense was at a few Greek parishes in Canada, but Canada is just that's a whole different story with Canada. But before we get into, I think, a bit more of a meta-analysis of what we're going to talk about, with kind of a view of this really hard about our view of general conspiracy, about kind of our perspective on the WEF and some of these other institutions and how it relates to real politics, I want to go to one of the most vaccinated countries in the world, which is the Holy Land in Israel. I don't know about Palestine exactly how much they got or didn't get the vaccine, but Israel, Robert Bourla himself, a dual Israeli citizen, a CEO of Pfizer, he, made sure that his country was very vaccinated, and we're seeing. But outside of what's going on with the vaccine there, we're seeing some big news. One with, I believe it was a very radical member of the Knesset, Ben-Gvir. He visited the Al-Aqsa mosque against the wishes of, I believe, even U.S. officials were like, "Why are you doing this? This is a escalation." And Ben-Gvir, of course, is an ultra-Zionist who believes that the Al-Aqsa mosque, the Dome of the Rock, where Muslims, it's a very holy place for Muslims, and actually technically for Christians, Jews as well, obviously, in their each respective tradition, how it relates to Abraham, Ishmael, Muhammad. But he believes that it should obviously be torn down and be a certain section of the third temple and the Jewish sacrifice to be, restarted. And this is something that St. Paisios talked about as far as the Third World War, that eventually the Al-Aqsa Mosque actually would be destroyed. And we've seen, I believe, since 2018, 2019, that there's been a mock Sanhedrin that conducts a mock sacrifice on the Temple Mount, preparing for this. And with Ben-Gvir, of course, come hooligans and radicals, and they'll come and they'll throw rocks at kids. And then the thing is, with these ministers, the IDF forces are kind of obligated to defend these people. So the optics is always very bad for more moderates in Israel, because they see these IDF troops that next thing you know, they get into some scuffle with some Muslim kid at a mosque. But to the ultra-Zionists, it doesn't really matter. They view all of it as pushing the envelope and, kind of these media victories for their cohorts. And unfortunately, it leads to terrible things happening. Like we saw, this wasn't an Orthodox seminary, but I believe it was an Anglican seminary, which, high church in many ways in the Holy Land. Some of these liturgies look more similar to Eastern Orthodox services. This Anglican church had a cemetery, and over 30 graves were desecrated by Israeli Jewish citizens. And these two events, them coinciding isn't necessarily a coincidence. There's definitely there's a push, and Netanyahu is back in power. And while there were actually even more ultra-Zionist members of the previous coalition, they were tempered by much more moderate members. They formed this big rainbow coalition. But now that Likud, the kind of standard right-wing Israeli nationalist party, they were the ones that pushed for Trump to recognize the Golan Heights and move the USMC to Jerusalem. Now they're back in power. It seems that some of these groups might be feeling a bit more emboldened. And we mentioned that in our previous episode when it comes to Russia-Israeli Putin relations. And now it seems that, as we mentioned before, Assad and Turkey, they're kind of in agreement that, the Israelis, they're funding the Kurds, they're not our guys. So if the U.S. is going to be doing work in 2023 to get Erdogan out, we may expect some Israeli help there.
Yeah, of course. I think where Russia, Israel, and Turkey differ is the fact that I believe that probably in their deepest dreams, Turkey and Israel would not mind if Assad had to go and they had to divide, Syria into their particular, spheres. For example, Israel expanding north, and of course, Turkey expanding southwards. So there's this understanding that, Israel and Russia can come to an agreement, but there is this opinion that, look, Putin actually supporting Syrian, the Syrian president Assad is, of course, a thorn in Israel's back. So will Israel actually listen to Putin? I think that's still on the table. It's not exactly neither here nor there. Now, of course, Ben-Gvir ascending to the Temple Mount is, I believe, the first time, as Financial Times reports, the first time in 5 years that an Israeli official minister has actually ascended the Temple Mount and actually visited some of those holy sites to both Jews and Muslims alike. And Ben-Gvir, even before anybody made any threats, of course, tweeted something quite provocative where he just said, and I'll just quote him here. He just tweeted, "The Israeli government, of which I am a member, will not surrender to a vile murdering organization. If Hamas thinks that it threatens me and this will deter me, let them understand that times have changed." So Hamas hasn't even threatened Ben-Gvir yet, but he's already kind of giving a precursor saying that, look, I'm not going to. And Hamas, for all those who don't understand, is essentially a radical Muslim group from Lebanon that Palestinians are very much members of, and this Hamas essentially is the most sort of radical. By radical, I mean very pro-Palestinian faction in the Palestinian and Lebanon area, in the Levant, so to speak. So Hamas is very much anti-Zionist as the Zionist parties are anti-Hamas. So it is like the oppositionary, sort of the balancing of the weights in the Holy Land at this point. And of course, all of this, him appearing on the Temple Mount is, I agree with the US analysts, like it could lead to an escalation. As Conrad said, IDF forces and military Israeli forces accompanying him, it looks really bad because they're all armed, proper assault rifles attachments and proper military. And it does look like the military is here to confiscate Muslim holy sites, as the threat has always been around for the last 100, at least not 100 years at this point, but at least the last 80 years. So that's the realistic thing that's, I suppose it's always there.
I'm, of course, in no way favor of, ecumenism with Muslims or anything of the sort, but it just goes to show you, the beloved of, you know, evangelicals, Christians in the West, they're driving the actual Christians in this region into the arms of Muslims. Because if you're an Orthodox Christian, you just had over 5,000 square meters of, very important real estate taken from you also by the IDF. And now you see this happening to Muslims. Like, you're going to be much more likely to ally with these people than, even the people that have perhaps a more similar theology to you that are literally, funding and supporting the people persecuting you, which, is a tragedy. But when it comes to, Christians and ecumenism and stuff, a big thing happened in the Catholic world. Pope Benedict, the actual Pope, as some in the Catholic world might have you want to believe, he passed away. It was a big deal. It's been kind of the talk of the town. A lot of people that aren't Christians and aren't Catholics, are like, y'all rest in piss, you're a pedophile, which it is in bad taste. That's not to say that, Pope Benedict didn't perhaps handle some of the abuse scandals in a bad way, but compared to what's going on now with Francis, many Catholics view it as a real mark and reminder of the real era they are in their church.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about the former Pope now who passed away. Like, just the fact that he was the first Pope, at least in recent history, the last 1,000 years, who actually actively, or not actively, but I suppose retired himself. And usually the popes they stay in their tenureship until death. So they were actually acting as Pope until they pass away and go off into the next life. And so Pope Benedict actually stepping down close to a decade ago now was probably one of the biggest things that have occurred has occurred in the Catholic Church, probably since, I don't know, maybe the fall of Constantinople and the emergence of the Uniate connection there. So it's a huge deal, and I don't think Catholics have even come to terms as to what it meant the last 10 several years to have two popes, one in retirement and one in sort of active duty. Pope Francis, who's still the acting pope now, and certain Catholics have even gone off into schism, claiming that, well, Pope Francis is not the real pope because look how liberal and progressive he is. Meanwhile, Pope Benedict was conservative. Now, Pope Benedict, he was more conservative, but he also held a lot of mainstream Catholic opinions, which, frankly, compared to, say, some of the Orthodox theological, ecclesiological, cultural takes do not even line up to that. So we have to keep that in mind. Pope Benedict, and he was very well respected, even the famous Russian Orthodox billionaire Malafeyev even gave him a very heartwarming sort of farewell. He said, look, I met the Pope once or twice, and like, he's a very respectable man, and very sorry to all the Catholics who feel deeply about his passing. And he was a very respectable Catholic Christian who tried to hold off the West from apostasy while he was still in his papal seat. And afterwards he mentions, and Malafeyev, this Russian billionaire, says, look, the Pope Francis compared to Pope Benedict is a complete disaster, at least for Catholic conservatives and those who actually want to hold on to their Western European traditions.
Benedict, many are saying now that he's passed, that before he passed, he was expressing extreme sadness and even surprise at Pope Francis's gutting of the Latin Mass. Because Pope Benedict, for those who don't know, he was the one that actually gave all Catholic priests the right of personal discernment to serve the traditional Latin Mass, but Pope Francis took that away, and now as a priest you have to have the blessing of your bishop to serve the traditional Latin Mass. And there are dozens if not hundreds of bishops in the Catholic Church that want nothing to do with the Latin Mass and want a very watered down, secularized, Protestantized Novus Ordo. And there's even articles now, people are in the left of the Catholic spectrum now that he's died. I'm seeing articles now that Pope Benedict has passed, it's time for the traditional Latin Mass to go entirely. And again, I don't mean to exploit a crisis in your church, but if that comes the case, there's the Western Rite and Orthodoxy, also the Eastern Rite is beautiful. Like, I encourage our Catholic friends that are listening to perhaps visit their local Orthodox church. If there's one thing I'm confident will not happen in the near future in Orthodoxy, it's some bizarre Orthodox Novus Ordos. So I'll hang that little morsel out for you right there.
Yeah, just to be respectable, like your journey to Orthodoxy, or at least being open-minded and looking into the Orthodox Church now that Pope Benedict has passed, should be, of course, looking at Pope Benedict's words himself, like, see what he had to say about the Eastern Orthodox Church, see what he had to say about our culture, some of our theology, our conservatism, and you may be surprised. So I think that's the starting point. definitely for those who have no idea what Eastern Orthodoxy is about, definitely look into that on that angle. As you can see, most Eastern Orthodox countries are extremely conservative. Their culture, their family values are being upheld to the highest degree. Meanwhile, of course, the Catholic Church, there are people at the top who want to change things. For example, if you look at the Catholic community in Germany, it's not very, at least those on the conservative angle are being pressured towards, some of the more liberal values, and some of the more progressive apostate opinions that are around. So the Catholic Church, it's, and then with the death of Pope Benedict, I think a certain door has closed. Like that era of wholesome leadership has ended. Like the Pope John Paul II, sort of, these Pope Benedict, these characters of great faith and sort of that had these old values, old 20th century opinions. Have Pope Francis, in many ways, compared to those previous popes, is a very 21st century pope. He even says, very 21st century things. And even when Pope Francis was elected to the see, I remember my grandmother even saying, like, oh, how bad could it be? Like, he's a Jesuit monk. He had no possessions. He's been a monastic for so many years. He's from South America. He speaks Latin. He, speaks Spanish. He's like, how bad could this poor monk be who, will be elected to the see? And look at the results now. So, look, with all due respect, like Catholics do need to, I think, open up to some of the words Pope Benedict was saying about Eastern Orthodoxy and just explore some of the options, because eventually some of the progressive and liberal changes occurring in the Roman Catholic Church will in fact come to your local parish. Yes, it's like Ronald Reagan once said, it's like trickle-down economics, right? Changes at the top will eventually trickle down to every diocese, every local parish, and you will feel it eventually. So this is, I suppose, just a warning. I can't tell you what to do, and I cannot make the move for you, but you do need to keep your options open.
Yeah, I think as we wrap this episode up, I think it's a good place regarding the Vatican to kind of look back on the 20th century and the history, the general arc of history. And the Church of God is always going to be a pivotal and critical place at whatever's going on in the world, at whatever machinations the devil and his willing minions among humanity want to throw at it. It's always going to be relevant. And as we saw in the 20th century, we saw, of course, the fall of the Ancient regime. I've called the alchemical transmutation of the world mind. We've all been gaslit into this modern and or postmodern, whether you're in the New Age or into the atheist secularism stuff, into this kind of just milieu of self-determination and no moral grounding, and everyone's looking for their meaning, and everyone in these countries has an identity crisis. All this stuff, it's just this fake nonsense. I always talk about a return to a reality, a return to the emperor, a return of the church. But the 20th century saw the death of that, and you saw the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, the East and the West, kind of floating out there. And I think seeing what happened to both in the 20th century gives us a bit of a picture into, which church ultimately is preserving the gospel and preserving the Eucharist and the sacraments of Christ in this age. And as we saw, I think in the 20th century, the Catholic Church ultimately became a bit of a servant of what you could call the global American empire at one end, and then just in general, the global financial interest, whether it's the Vatican Bank or Pope John Paul II becoming a hardcore kind of cold warrior at the with Ronald Reagan and all this stuff. That's not to say that communism was bad, but we know that was a dialectic that was enforced, and as communism fell, we've now been able to actually see Christian rebirth, whereas in the West that supposedly quote unquote won the Cold War, we're seeing horrible secularist decline. And what happened in the 20th century, it wasn't like the church, the Eastern Church was doing necessarily the same thing. Sure, there was some Sergianism going on, but there was just thousands of martyrs. As Father Josiah Trenham says, more martyrs were created in that time that finally since the early church. Like, that's the only comparable era as far as amount of martyrs produced under the Soviet yoke. And now that we've seen it emerge from that, we're finally seeing, whether it's the conflict in Ukraine, we're seeing the growth of orthodoxy worldwide finally, and kind of its reassertment and its reinvigoration as a force against the forces of evil. And again, that's not to say that there aren't fantastic Catholic people, and there aren't even Catholic communities that are in their part of the world doing good deeds and doing good things. But I think just again, from metapolitical, theopolitical, as you might say, our podcast is about, perspective, the arc of the 20th century is, if you look at the place of the Orthodox Church, it provides what I consider the most holistic understanding of world events.
Very well said, Conrad. And I think with those fine words, I think we can close off the first episode of 2023. We appreciate everybody who's listened to this point. It's been a long episode, but of course, as the first one of the year, I think we should cover most of the subjects least at hand so that we can move on to, some of the more interesting developments that will take place, we believe, in January and February of this year, moving into, Great Lent after the Christmas period and Theophany and all the other great Christian feast days upon us. Okay, so Merry Christmas for those who've celebrated this passing weekend, and hope you guys have a great week. Conrad, do you have any parting words for our audience?
No, I think this was a fantastic conversation. Be sure to listen to our previous episode. It's good. It gives a lot of analysis, some of our reflections on 2022. Click the links to the stuff in the description. It will provide even more context. And with all of that, be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. That'll be linked below. Obviously, follow us on Twitter, World War Now _. Subscribe to us on Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. It really helps us out. Please make a Substack account. That is also fantastic. We want to hear from you in the comments. I do my best to reply to the comments. We've actually got some great insight. We've got some great people in this community that are posting links, posting books, translations to stuff that you can't find anywhere else. In our YouTube comments, we have people sending things from Serbian saints, all sorts of fantastic stuff. So make an account on Substack. It really helps us out. We're going to have some future threads and stuff that we can interact with you as well. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, it really helps us there as well. Share the videos, obviously. Follow me on Twitter, GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri, Canonist, the Orthodox Canonist. His account's been blown up recently. And all the support's been fantastic. I wish everybody a Merry Christmas, especially our old calendar friends, a Happy New Year. And say your prayers. God bless. Pray for the church in Ukraine. And we'll see you next time.